I came to understand the sovereignty of God, what we call Calvinistic soteriology. I came to understand it because I had put so many years into eschatology that I came to recognize a sovereign God in eschatology. You can't study prophecy and not come away with the notion that God's in control. Seems pretty obvious. When God says, my son will be born in this year, when you've got Daniel saying 70 weeks of years, and after 6 of those weeks of years have ticked off, then Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. And then Sir Robert Anderson sits down in the late 1800s and does the math and shows that sure enough, from the time of the decree of Artaxerxes to the day of Jesus' triumphal entry was exactly that number of years. Well, that's a God who's in an awful lot of control. When he says, and it'll be in Bethlehem, and it'll be to a virgin, and it'll be to, and all that stuff comes true. Or when Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are that head of gold, and after you there's going to become lesser kingdoms, and he describes the next 700 years of Middle Eastern history. And it all came true, every single bit of it to the letter, the way he described it. That's a God that's in an awful lot of control. And so I understood from studying eschatology that God was sovereign. As I wrote in my book, A Brief History of the Future, that little phrase that I used to use a lot that says prophecy works because the future is definite. If the future is not definite, prophecy doesn't work. Unless God's in absolute control of everything everyone does, prophecy doesn't work. Unless God's in charge of the day and the time and the hour when things happen, if there's any room for randomness, if there's any room for somebody of their own free will to go, nah, I'm not going to do that, prophecy doesn't work anymore. So when I was first confronted with Calvinistic soteriology and the idea of an absolutely sovereign God, I went, yeah, I know that God. Oh yeah, that's that God that's in charge of everything. The God who's in charge of history, who's in charge of prophecy, who proves through prophecy that he's sovereign. And so when somebody first said, okay, now take those concepts of sovereignty and move it into your soteriology, what about salvation? Is God still sovereign? I didn't have that hard a time making that transition because I already knew that God from my study of eschatology. Now I'm going to make a very controversial statement. Only premillennial, literalistic, Christ coming back to earth to keep all those promises he made to Israel in the Old Testament, only that eschatology is consistent with a soteriology of an absolutely sovereign God. Otherwise, you have a God who makes promises to groups of people in the Old Testament, then writes them off, says, never mind, and then comes and says to Shane, now I know that I was really inconsistent with that group, but trust me when I tell you that I intend to save you. It's a very inconsistent God. If God makes a promise to Israel, but then keeps that promise in the New Covenant Gentile church, did he actually keep that promise? No. If you say to Shane, I promise to make you dinner tonight. When you get home, dinner's on the table. I promise to make you dinner tonight. He gets home, you're not there. But you call him from my house and you say, I made Jim the nicest dinner you've ever seen. I made your favorite, and he's really enjoying it. Did you keep your promise? You made dinner. Did you keep your promise? No, because you didn't promise me, you promised him. And yet there are people running around with a theology that says God can make all these promises to Israel and name them by name. And then Jesus can die and bury and resurrect, and then Paul can come along in Romans 9, 10, and 11 and talk about it all over again. And then conclude that after the fullness of the Gentiles is brought in, then all Israel will be saved. And then speaking of Israel, he will say, they are enemies of the gospel for your sake. But as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sake. Paul was still saying, Israel's still Israel, and they're still good to go on all the promises because God is consistent. That's New Covenant, New Testament theology. Paul expected the same thing I expect, which is that God will keep every promise he ever made to whoever he made it to. And if he promised to save Shane, he's going to save Shane. And if he promised to save Israel, he's going to save Israel. And that's premillennial theology. And amillennialism denies all that, and so I believe that it fundamentally denies Scripture. But I've bothered to go back and look at the history and see where it developed from and where it came from. It did not come from exegeting the Scripture. Do you understand that? You give a man a Bible and you put him in a cave, and you give him a flashlight and you say, I'll see you in a year. He will not come out of that cave an amillennialist. Won't happen. Because the tenets of amillennialism are not in Scripture. They're external to Scripture and have to be read into the text. How will a guy reading the Bible come out of the cave? Premillennial, because that's what it actually says. He'll also come out sovereign grace. He just won't know that word.